Welcome to the 4-to-1 counterpoint response video. We're going to be looking at these responses, pointing out any mistakes, and then also showing how we can fix these mistakes, and then also discuss how could we prevent these mistakes, how could we stop these mistakes from happening in the first place. I'm going to first go through them, I'm going to show any mistakes in them, and then I'll walk through how to fix these mistakes. Then I'll review the final product, and we'll see what's going on there. If there's anything that maybe is good or maybe something that's not so good. Now I'm going to be looking for any mistakes in the melodies, leaps that are unwanted, maybe things that aren't recovered if they are leaped to. Also looking for a conjunct melody and looking for parts where maybe the melody is broken apart and disjunct, which is something we don't want. Because for good voice leading, it's good to establish the good melodic fluency so the listener can follow that voice without it jumping around and being hard to figure out, okay, which voice is this or which voice is it functioning as. Also how perfect intervals are going to be approached, as well as other things. So let's get into it. First, we do see a perfect interval right here. We see an octave in measure 2, but we need to note that since the top voice in each measure is going to be traveling in oblique motion for the whole measure in these exercises, since this is a blank to 1 exercise, then when we have this octave down here, basically this is going to be approached just fine because you're allowed to have an approach to a perfect interval where one voice travels or leaps to it and the other voice is staying in oblique motion. That covers the fact that if we're looking out for these perfect intervals, we want to be looking at the first beat of the measure to where the given melody is going to be changing notes and also the counterpoint will be changing notes as well. Here on measure 4, we see an octave on beat 1 and is approached in contrary motion from the beat before it, the fourth beat of the measure 3. So as you can see in measure 3, it goes down in stepwise motion to a fifth from a third. It goes back up to a third with just a third leap from the fifth, and then we see the contrary motion from that third in the counterpoint, and we also see the contrary motion in the given melody. So it's also good to point out the fact that the melody, for the most part, besides this leap, but then it goes right back to it, is traveling in contrary motion with the given melody. And then within that measure, you do have an octave traveling in stepwise motion ending on a fifth. And again, since the top voice is staying oblique, this is perfectly fine. Then we see it leaves from the perfect fifth, and it goes to a third also in contrary motion, so that's good because when you're also arriving at a perfect interval, leaving in contrary motion is also going to help with voice leading. From this third on beat 1 of measure 5, we can see it leaps down a rather large leap of a sixth to an octave, which is then recovered in stepwise motion all in the same measure, which leaves us on a sixth, which then just steps down to a third in the next measure. I move measure 7 down here because there's an approach to a fifth I want to talk about. It makes it easier to read. So let's just retrace real quickly. We had that octave which led us up to a fifth in the same measure. Then I was saying how that approaches the third in contrary motion. So it's leaving the perfect interval to the third in contrary motion. Very good. Then the leap of the sixth is recovered in stepwise motion. So everything is good here, but now we go to measure 7. And we can see that the measure before it, we ended on a C with an E with the given melody. So if we imagine that CE, we can see that from there, it's also traveling in contrary motion to a tenth. It's not that you have to travel in contrary motion to an imperfect interval, but contrary motion is always good for voice leading. Especially if you're going to do a pretty good leap like we do here. Since large leaps can put the note in a different area in the register, it's good when the two voices are traveling in contrary motion when one does a big leap, just because it's going to be that much easier to follow that voice. We can see the given melody from the E just travels up a fourth to an A, and then we can see from where we had the C in the counterpoint, that travels down a fifth to F. So I'm not going to comment on too many leaps here that are perfectly fine, but here in the beginning I just want to show a few of them, that okay, we have these leaps, which is anything from a small leap like a third, and then you get a little bigger to a fourth, fifth, or sixth. Don't want a seventh. You can do a leap of up to an octave, and anything past that you don't want in these counterpoint exercises. you also don't want augmented or diminished intervals. So that's where you want to be careful if you're in your something like harmonic minor, to we're going to be altering the scale, like raising the leading tone, which can give you that augmented second between the 6th and 7th degree in that case. You also have the third of the chord, which is just an augmented chord. So right off the bat, you can have an augmented fifth, you can have an augmented second pretty easily there, and you don't want that. And then also, just if you're in the major scale, or you're in something branching from the major scale, like a mode or a minor scale also mode, but something that is non-altered, then you're still going to have that tritone from scale degrees 4 and 7 from your major scale, which of course translates into all the other modes and such from the major scale, just in different areas. It's good to keep in mind of what scale degrees in the key or mode that I'm using will create that tritone, also potentially augmented. From that 10th, we can see that we're traveling up stepwise motion. We do a small leap of a third, which brings us to a 6th. And then the next measure, we have a perfect 5th, which is then being approached in direct motion, because we see the counterpoint going down and we see the given melody going down also. So we don't want that. We want contrary motion to our perfect intervals. So what could we do to fix this? Think about a possible solution before I show you the answer. Okay, so we need to realize one thing is that our goal is going to be for this last note before the next measure to be below this next note in the counterpoint. And that's because the given melody is already here. It's already traveling down. So therefore, to travel in contrary motion, then we have to be traveling up in the counterpoint. Now we know that we want this note to be somewhere below the other note. Let's say I place it up here to where the octave is. You can see that it would be approaching this 5th in contrary motion. I'm going to change this note in a second, but I want to point out the fact that it's perfectly fine to travel from one perfect interval to a different perfect interval using contrary motion. So here we have a perfect 5th, a perfect octave to a perfect 5th in contrary motion. And when you have a perfect interval from your previous measure going to your next measure, the best thing you can basically do is travel in contrary motion. Again, this is to two different perfect intervals and not two of the same intervals, so not something like a compound octave going to a closed octave in contrary motion. That would not be allowed. So you have to be two different perfect intervals. Now we need to change this note, and if you look throughout the melody, you don't really see anywhere where the note uses a neighboring tone to go up and then goes back down to the original note. In fact, we see a lot of passing tones, and we only have one other neighboring tone. So let's take advantage of the neighboring tone, and let's move this note down to a 10th as well. Now where we still had that leap from before, and it's still recovered in stepwise motion. And then from there, it's not like it does anything big, it just does a small leap of a third, and then it's traveling in stepwise motion from there. Now we can see the contrary motion from the given melody and the counterpoint. So last thing before moving on from this area is that having two perfect intervals traveling in contrary motion is probably the best thing you can do when having two perfect intervals. But again, you're using two perfect intervals, which in their state by themselves are not the best for voice leading. So because of that, this is like the best choice if you have two perfect intervals next to each other, but it's not the best choice for voice leading. And because of that, this is something you can totally do. But are you going to be striving to put a lot of octaves going to fifths in contrary motion on purpose in your music? Well, in that case, there might be better options, like going from an imperfect interval to another imperfect interval in contrary motion, which would give you even better voice leading. So a lot of times it's trying to figure out what's the best option that I can do here. Other than that, any other perfect intervals, we see this perfect fifth in the penultimate measure. So that'd be measure 11, and here we see that it is traveling in contrary motion to that perfect fifth from the note right before it, creating a third. Then we also see a fifth interval going to the tonic in stepwise motion. So again, it's always good to leave those perfect intervals in contrary motion, but it's a necessity to approach them in contrary motion. That's it for the corrections on this one. Now that I explained those basic things, you'll see that the other examples are going to pick up some speed and go by a little quicker. I think it's good to explain some stuff before I just start going into all these analyzations. Next, let's just look at the shape of the melody. So we can see from where it starts off, it dips down a little bit, and it's following a nice flow. Nothing really too disjunct, pretty conjunct for the most part. You can see that actually up until measure 5, all of the leaps that we have are just small leaps of a third. The rest of it is just stepwise motion of seconds. And I actually did already comment on that leap, which is the 6th, recovered just fine. And since it's recovered, that reestablishes that melodic fluency. So just to point out that up to that moment, it's traveling nicely and melodically fluent. In other words, it's nice and stepwise up until this little high point here, which then it leaps down, but since it's recovered and keeps traveling in stepwise motion after that, it's basically like the voice just relocated down here and kept going. You can see where we went from where we started on the upper portion of the treble staff, relocated down to the middle, and then from that brief section, which lasts a little more than 2 measures, we do a little leap down to the bottom portion of the treble staff, which then brings us back through the middle, back to the upper part of the treble staff for a bit, and then we're going back down, so we're kind of having some more sharp turns in here, but in fact you can see it's basically all still traveling in stepwise motion. Again, with the biggest leaps being a third. That definitely adds interest to the voice too, because we see the registers not just staying in one place, so that's actually a really good thing. Because again, the stepwise motion is helping the listener follow the voice, and these peaks and dips in the register is just making it more interesting. And as the 4-to-1 counterpoint video explains, you have a lot more of an availability to travel further within a measure having 4 notes. Okay, so we can see that if we have complete stepwise motion from beat 1 in one measure to beat 1 in the next measure, you can see that creates the interval of a fifth. So you can travel quite far from one measure to the other one, especially if you start adding some leaps in there. You can imagine you can go quite far. And that's where it's actually a little more difficult to stay in one part of the register, which can be boring for one part, but also sometimes you need the register to stay in a certain area so you can do what you want to do. So you can create the right intervals, approach those perfect intervals the right way, and everything else all while maintaining that stepwise motion. So you can see it's a pretty conjunct melody with just a kind of relocation of the register once, and then we have the ups and downs. The most disjunct thing about it is actually the final cadence, which actually brings a sense of a different period, which helps support the fact that it's the end, especially also with the notes chosen. So we can see here we don't have the typical leading tone to tonic cadence. We still do have scale degree 2 in the given melody going to scale degree 1, but the counterpoint goes from scale degree 5 to scale degree 1, leaping up a fourth, so we have that 5-to-1 cadence. And this whole measure is basically just telling you this is chord 5. You start on the first note of the 5 chord, where it's making a fifth, then you travel up in voice motion with that dissonant passing tone in there to the 3rd scale degree, completing that chord of scale degree 5. Then from there you just go down to the root of the chord. So it's a very strong 5-to-1 cadence there. I guess last thing before moving on to the next one is talking about the chords. Like I've explained in a previous video, it's good to understand that we're not dealing with the bass clef at all. We're not dealing in that bass range. So if this was to be filled up further to where we'd be putting notes in the bass range, in that case, then the 6th interval above the bass note does not necessarily have to imply a first inversion triad. In fact, the bass note is going to distinguish if it's an inverted chord or not. We see a 6th interval with D and B. So just a tip here, if you're starting to think about your chords in your exercises, don't overcomplicate it too much if you're in your upper ranges, saying like something like, oh, let's say I don't want to do a 6th interval here because I don't want to be implying the 5th chord in first inversion, with the note B here having that 6th. But you need to realize that in a real life situation, there's a good chance you'd be putting more notes below this, or maybe those notes would already be there. Other than the fact of, let's say you're writing like a solo piece for an instrument that's in the treble range, a solo violin piece. Okay, then maybe you need to think a little further of what chords you're implying, since you're not going to have those notes below it. I'm just trying to point out the fact that you don't need to worry so much about implying inverted intervals if you know that you're going to be adding more notes below this in a real life situation. Because in that case, you have your bass note telling you which inversion it is. Like here, if we had a B down here, it'd be telling us root position, no inversion. And then above that, we'd have the notes in the chord, but in fact, we could have those in any order. And that would still be a root position, because the other notes above it can be mixed up, basically, is what I'm explaining. And you will see this a lot if you're doing score reading. You'll say, whoa, the top of the chord looks like it's a second inversion chord, but the bottom of it doesn't. And then from there, we have a lot of different chords. To name them, we have chord 6, chord 3, and if you pay attention to the intervals used, they're going to be implying a chord. So like here we had that 6, 8, 7, 6. So the 6 and the 8 are all going to be notes in a chord. Again, here you can see a 3, 4, 5 going back to a 3. So of course that's just highlighting a triad. What triad is it highlighting? Let's see where it goes down to. So we go down to a C. And to figure out a melodic interval, you just stack the notes that are in that interval. So here we have a descending melodic interval. And of course, when it's a descending interval, you're still always reading it from the bottom up. So it's a descending interval of a third. And that's all you need to think about it. It's especially helpful when you're looking at it when you're reading it, because you can see it's going up and down a third. So we have that C, E, G chord, which would be chord 6 of E major. I'm not going to be mentioning the sharps of the key because we're going to be working with different keys here. You see, in this case, the sharps or maybe the flats in the key signature. So I'm just going to be saying the notes. Okay, so some interesting stuff with going from chord 1 to chord 7 in first inversion, and now we're at chord 6. So I think rather interesting, actually, and not so conventional. But you can see where we made it work already in this two-voice situation. I'm not going to go through every chord and every measure individually, because that would take a while, and I'm about to move on to the next one, but I also just want to explain the fact that every measure by itself, every one measure is containing one chord. So that's good because we have a harmonic rhythm going on here, but it's also the fact that it builds expectation. We expect every measure to have a change of chord, and in fact that's what we get delivered. So it could be nice if maybe a measure or two or somewhere throughout it there's a change in the harmonic rhythm, and it's not just what you expect. This alone can just make it more interesting for the listener. And of course there's a balance to everything. That's it for this first example. Okay, A flat major below. From here I'm going to start picking up some more speed, not re-explaining what I already explained before. First thing, looking for any mistakes. Right away we see this octave right here, and it's being approached in direct motion by a fifth. And there's a lot of bad things happening here. It's a good example to see what you should not do. So you see the counterpoint is going up to this A here, and then the next note in the given melody is also an A. So already having the counterpoint be the same note that the given melody is going to be traveling to in the very next beat in the next measure, not going to help with voice leading, trying to figure out which one of these is which voice when you have that same note. Then from there you can also see we have a perfect interval of a fifth going to an octave. So it's not only just any interval traveling in direct motion, it's two perfect intervals traveling in direct motion to each other. So really bad for voice leading. We do see it's a large leap of an octave, which is recovered, but we're going to get rid of this so it doesn't matter. So what could we do to fix this? Okay, so we need to think here that if we have a perfect interval in the first beat of this next measure here, we're going to have to travel in contrary motion. So in this case, if we stay with this octave of this A, our counterpoint would have to be on a G, with the two ledger lines below the treble staff. So one note below this. As you can see, that would be tough to get all the way from the sixth interval starting on the first beat of this measure, going all the way down to, well, it'd be another G, be all the way an octave down from where we're starting from. And remember, we're trying to keep with that melodic fluency, while at the same time staying within an octave, since we're in the treble to alto range here. So I guess that's where I didn't point in my last example. We had a few tenths, which for treble to soprano is really not always the best practice. It would be better practice to try to always stay within an octave if you're just trying to shoot for the best voice leading possible. Going over an octave can cause some voice leading issues and make it harder to deal with, unless of course you're in your bass to tenor voice, which then that's perfectly fine to go over an octave up to a compound fifth. So instead of worrying about traveling in contrary motion to a perfect interval, if we change this interval just into an imperfect consonance, then we don't have to approach it in contrary motion, and we may even be able to keep a better melodic fluency. So as you can see already, this chunk of the melody is dipping down pretty low compared to everything else. It's not bouncing down and then back up though, so I mean it is still keeping that melodic fluency. What could we do to fix this situation? Thinking about that, changing this into an imperfect interval, what could we do also in the previous measure to keep that melodic fluency? So as you can see, everything but the first note of this measure changed. And now from the sixth, we're actually just going down a third to an octave, traveling stepwise back up to a sixth with that dissonant seventh in there. Then no more perfect intervals at all between these two measures. Now we have two consecutive sixths. So this brings up a good point, that when you have two imperfect intervals, they could be traveling in parallel motion if they're the same type of sixth, like a major sixth to another major sixth, but it's a lot easier just to call imperfect intervals consecutive intervals. And this is because you might have a minor sixth going to a major sixth, and if you had a bunch of sixths one after another, instead of thinking of parallel sixth, you could think of a bunch of consecutive sixths, because again, those could be alternating or staying in minor or major, you may not know, and it may just make it easier just to call them consecutive without thinking, okay, are they parallel, are they not? But it's a lot easier with the perfect intervals to see if they're parallel. So that's why it can be better to say things like parallel fifths, parallel octaves, and then consecutive thirds, consecutive sixths. Because with the perfect intervals, you don't have the major and minor to think about. You only have to think about augmented or diminished, which in most keys, in most situations, that can be pretty obvious. Okay, we have those consecutive sixths, and now is there any other problems? Try to find any other problems in this example. So it looks like there's no more problems. We do see a perfect interval going to another perfect interval on the first beat of this measure from the last beat of the measure before it, and it's an octave traveling in contrary motion to a fifth. Perfectly fine. And then from there we have another fifth on the penultimate measure, which is approached in contrary motion. So now to look at the melody and the melodic fluency, we can see mostly seconds and at most thirds in the first three measures, and also a nice change in the register. It's not just staying in one place, so we have some interest there. From measure 3 to 4, we have a leap of a sixth, which is then recovered in stepwise motion. Again, relocating the melody from the lower middle portion of the staff, now leaping up to the top portion and going back down to the lower portion again. Basically all stepwise motion. Again, biggest thing is a third. So we get right here, we have a leap of a fifth, which is then recovered, which from that leap of the fifth, that fifth is embellished, but then it goes back up. This plays on two things: the fact that it's not as important to recover a leap going down, but it's always good to recover a leap no matter what, just not as important. And then also, if you're thinking about this note being embellished, acting as one interval, you do see it recovers back up after. And also the embellishment is just going a step down. So nothing really taboo or anything going on there. We continue with the stepwise motion, some thirds here and there, and that's basically continued all the way to the very end. we do have this brief moment in the melody to where we do have some disjunct pattern, and it results with basically this note being down here being just a little bit random in how it's interacting with the rest of the melody, to where if you follow the melody without that note, you can see the fluency in it, and that note is just a bump in the melody. So those are just little things to look out for. It's just the interval of a third, but again, the role that it's playing is not really like everything else, to where when we do even have a small leap, it's the continuation of the melodic fluency. While this leap of this third, it is an embellishing tone, so it's embellishing just a root position triad, but maybe that could have been something different, like throwing in an upper neighboring tone to where now the melody is stepping up and then it's dipping up a little bit just to go right back down, and now we have more melodic fluency. To talk about the chords before moving on to the next one, I would say this one's not nearly as interesting as the last one, and I would furthermore say this one is more conventional as well. Of course, you got to listen to it when it's done and see maybe this is the sound that you actually want versus the last one. But it's good to point out that there's not a whole lot going on within the chords here. You can look at every measure as a change of chord again, so just like the last one already, we have the same thing to where the listener is going to expect that in every next measure we're going to have a change of chord. So of course that could be good for the listener if you establish that expectation, and then somewhere along the way you throw in some more chords, or maybe even have one chord go for two measures. Just something that throws off the expectation but plays on leading up to the expectation. So if we look at the actual chords from measure to measure, because there's one chord per measure, starting on the first measure, we have a chord 1 going to chord 5, which then goes to chord 1 to 4 and 5. Not a lot going on there, but then right after it, we see again that we have a 1, 4, and 5. Unlike the other one, we're building some motivity in the chord scheme. Even from the very beginning, we had a 1, 5, then we have 2 1, 4, 5s in a row. So you'd probably expect another 1, 4, 5, and you get a 1, 6, 5, and then again a 1. So with that 6th chord, I mean, you didn't really expect that. You probably expected a 4. Being a third above what you expect, it's not like the most drastic change or anything, but that kind of fills in the gap of the 4, and then right after you have the 5 again. So that kind of replaces what would be the 4 and the 1, 4, 5 pattern. Besides that though, you still have the 1 and the 5. And then it goes back to the 1. So I would say within the chord scheme, it could definitely be improved to not only lessen some expectation, but also just to add some more chords. It's basically 3 chords in the whole thing with that 6th chord added in it. So definitely could be more interesting. Before moving on to the next one, I'll point out the fact that the 1-4-5 pattern can actually sound really nice. You will find it in box music, just a simple 1-4-5, 1-4-5, 1-4-5 pattern repeating throughout a passage. So again, it's not anything to say that it's bad. It's just to say we could make it more interesting. And we could also realize to where this can lead to some expectations. So with the understanding, you could use that to your advantage. Maybe you want to lead to some expectations when you're writing your own music. Maybe you don't, and you can understand how you can do that within the chords, within the notes, and many other things. Moving on to the next one, we now have a bass and tenor relationship. So now we're reading in the bass clef, and we also are able to do our compound thirds, compound fifths, or in other words, our tenths and our twelfths. Taking advantage of this can give us more freedom in our counterpoint response. Right off the bat, you can see the perfect intervals are all approached fine that are on beat 1. And since we have a blank to 1 relationship in our counterpoint to our given melody, and that 1 being the given melody, means that every time our given melody changes a note, we have a new measure. So that's why we're looking at those perfect intervals on beat 1 of the measure. Of course, in a real-life situation, you're not going to be looking at just beat 1 of every measure. You're going to be looking at each time the given melody that you're writing your counterpoint for is changing. So that may not be every measure. It's something really good to comprehend. We see an octave approaching contrary motion. we see a compound fifth approached in contrary motion. Other than that, in the second to last measure, we also see a fifth, and then last measure we see an octave, both approached in contrary motion. So now to do what we've been doing, let's follow the motion of the melody. As we can see, it's pretty stepwise for the most part. We have this little leap of a fourth right here, which then keeps going back to the same stepwise motion as before. And yeah, in fact, looking at it, those four measures are completely stepwise motion except for the interval of the fourth. That while also maintaining a variation of consonant and dissonant. So these dissonant intervals aren't repeating the same thing. Basically, the whole thing has a lot of variation in it, and it's basically all stepwise. So pretty good there. From this last note in measure 4, we can see we're leaping all the way up to the treble clef in measure 5. If I started using ledger lines above this bass clef, you might have to think about it a little more, and it might not be as straightforward to read as just right here where you can see where the notes are. That leads us to the fact that we're leaping from an A at the top of this bass clef, and we're leaping up a sixth interval to an F here at the bottom of the treble clef staff. Then from that leap of the sixth, it's recovered in stepwise going down. So our leap is using scale degree 2, so not the best choice. It is over scale degree 5, acting as the fifth note in that chord. So that's helpful, but being the melody and traveling a lot quicker, being chord 2 chosen as the high point is not the best choice. The best choices would be scale degrees 1 and 5. And then again, that high point is a compound fifth, which is approached in contrary motion. We then go from the treble range back down into the bass range, from this 10th to this 8th, so just a leap of a third, which with one more leap of a third returns us back into stepwise motion again. And in this case, we don't really have any random moments in the melody. We do have this fifth going down to this third here, and then it's going back up, but then you can see as after that this is going back up, it's continuing that motion of this note right before. So you can see the continuation of the stepwise motion going along. There aren't really random notes. Every time a note go down into a different area in the register, you can see then it's picking back up, or it's responding to it somehow. So here we actually see an embellishment of a first inversion triad. And in fact, that's one of the embellishments, is the 5-3-5 or the 6-3-6. Not the 6-4-6 though, implying the second inversion. And in fact, we can see that we're approaching up to that. We're going up here, and then it's leading us back down, leading us back up. So it all works out. It's all pretty melodically fluent, even with some leaps here and there. The last thing to note is the chords used and how there's something interesting happening right here in the beginning. You have chord 1 implied in the first measure with just a lower neighboring tone and a passing tone acting as two dissonances in the implied harmony or chord at the time. Then we're going to a sixth interval, which is implying a G major chord in first inversion, chord 3 at the moment, so chord 3 in first inversion, and that's because from that 6 you also go down to the third, further supporting that first inversion, and then you have some passing tones, the 4th and the 5, and you could look at the 5 possibly as a passing tone if you're still thinking about this as implying that first inversion. Maybe it's just going through the 4 and the 5. Sometimes you can have 2 passing tones when going through the interval of a 4th instead of 1 passing tone through the interval of a 3rd. But in fact, I think this note F here acts in an ambiguous way. And not ambiguous in terms of voice leading to where that would be bad, but more in terms of what exactly is it doing in the harmony. And it's only for that brief moment, so of course it's not really a problem. It's more interesting to look at and consider what could be going on here, and then also listening and trying to listen to what's happening as a result, because to sum it up, this F could be acting like a lingering dissonance in the next measure, to where in the next measure we have a G octave, which could be implying like a G chord in first inversion. And the reason why I say this is because if you think about the notes that you heard in your previous measure, right after that first beat, the 6th, with the given melody, we have a 3 going to a 4 and a 5. So it's like a first inversion triad implied right there. Then in fact right after that we have a G, which is 1/3 below this B here. So if we stacked everything in those two measures on top of each other, we could see where that would be implying like a phantom seventh dissonance in this measure. And in fact, at the last beat of this measure, you again have the seventh, kind of further implying that this measure is implying a G major seventh chord, and this seventh from the measure before is lingering in this measure still, because it's literally being that note that's acting like the seventh in this measure just right before it, all while being both chord G in these measures, just first inversion in measure 2 and root position in measure 3. So it kind of further supports everything there to where you have two of the same chords and they're flipping inversions, and you're getting a first inversion and also a taste of a root position seventh chord just within the harmonies in those two measures there. I just find that interesting. Other than that, there's actually a lot of changes within the chords too. It's not just like a 1-4-5 like the one before, so this can add more interest. So from that root position chord 3, we could think about this measure as a chord 4 in first inversion, highlighting that 3, 4, 5, 6, to where now I can change this to a passing tone if I'm thinking about this as a passing tone in the harmony. Even though this is a consonant interval, it's still acting as a passing tone in the chord, since the chord tones we're highlighting are the third and the sixth. Then again, chord 5 in this measure, which then goes to chord 1 in the next measure. So for a high point, highlighting chord 5 going to chord 1, that is a good thing. Just the fact that the note chosen for the melody acting as the high point is scale degree 2, not the best choice. Moving on from chord 1, we have a chord 5, so setting up an expectation. We always hear 1-4-5s in music, it's just super common, so we're probably expecting a 1-4-5, especially after a recovery of a high point 5 to a 1. But in fact, we get a chord 7 in first inversion, going to a chord 1 in first inversion. So again, I can have that double passing tone there. Then chord 3 in first inversion, taking us to chord 5 and then to chord 1. So as you can see, some interesting chords there. Nothing too crazy. It's not like the perfect chords, but they're chords that you're easily going to be able to work with if you're trying to expand this into more voices. Because there are some chords that basically no matter if you go from this chord to this chord, you're basically going to have good voice leading options no matter what. That doesn't always exist, but sometimes you can make it work basically. And it's good to not only be trapped in a certain option that you can only do this chord to that chord, but try to free it up a little more and say, okay, I want this chord to that chord, how can I make this work with good voice leading? For the next example, we have the bass to tenor range again. And again, just like last time, we have this leap up to the treble clef, so that's why we have the treble clef down here just to show you that. As you can see, the rest of it's blank. Getting into this one, we can see a perfect fifth approached in direct motion on measure 4 from measure 3. And then we can also see a perfect fifth again approached in direct motion in measure 7 from measure 6. Those are the two spots of direct motion. So how can we fix these starting on measure 3 to measure 4? As you can see, I still am applying the same chords. I just switched around some notes. I actually got rid of the perfect interval on the first beat of this measure, or in other words, where the given melody is changing a note. And because of that, I don't have to worry about approaching in contrary motion, which helps me keep that melodic fluency. And I still use the fifth, and I still use the same notes. I basically kind of just rearrange them in different orders. Now measure 6 to measure 7. We have the same thing, direct motion to a perfect fifth. What can we do to fix this one? Try to think about the answer before I give it to you. We could do something like this to where we have the upward motion up to a 10th, which then creates the contrary motion to the 5th. But the only problem to note here is that right before this, we are going from a C down to the G, which then leads us down to F, and then we kind of do the same thing, then we just go back up G, and then we do A and C. There's just a very slight difference in the notes used. Now those things are fixed, let's just look at the melodic fluency now. We see the melody starting at the top of the bass staff, and we see a nice shape to the melody. There's not any random bumps. And just like before, we're seeing all stepwise motion and at most thirds from measures 1 to 7. And actually I'm going to do this. I'm going to end it here on measure 6 so you can see where measure 7 leaps up to measure 8. And before that leap, it's all stepwise motion besides some thirds here and there. Oh, and there we go. I didn't label the changes that I made, so my bad if that was bothering you. So as you can see, the melody stays in the upper range of the staff for the most part up until that leap there. And with that, there definitely is some interest in what is going on. There's different intervals being chosen. You do see 2 5 4 3 patterns right next to each other, but for the most part it's pretty different. But then with that, there's not too much interest in the register. It is a little bit boring. Then at the leap, we see the leap of a fifth going from B up to F, and it's also approaching a compound perfect interval, a compound perfect fifth. So you can see the contrary motion approaching that. So it's funny because it's the same BDF as the one before, if you noticed. In this case, though, the B on the bottom is acting as chord 2, and the F is acting as scale degree 6. So not really a good choice for the chord or the note chosen on the high point in the counterpoint. Then it does resolve onto chord 1, as well as being recovered, but going from chord 2 to chord 1 is definitely not a cadence, and it's not a very strong change in chord or pull of a chord like where chord 5 wants to pull you into chord 1. Okay, so not the strongest high point in sense of harmony. It is a strong high point in the sense that it is leaped to and then recovered, but it's not supported harmonically being a good solid state of a high point. Talking about the chords, and this one's rather interesting because there's a lot of variation here. Chord 1 goes to chord 5. As you're seeing, this is a very common thing in this response. It's just kind of something that the given melody is calling for, and you can probably partially see why with the given melody starting from the tonic and then going to the 5th degree. But moving on, we go to chord 3 in the 3rd measure, which leads us to 6th in the 4th measure, and then chord 3 first inversion in measure 5, which then from there we go to chord 6 in first inversion. It's interesting if you saw it because we had chord 3, chord 6, and then chord 3 first inversion, and then 6 first inversion, so they played on each other there. It's a very nice musical thing to do something and then do the same thing in an inverted version, especially with thirds and sixths. And here it's inverting the center of the harmony from the bass line to the counterpoint. Depending on if we're in the root position, then it's in the lower voice, which is our given melody. But then in the first inversion, the harmony center is going to the upper voice, the counterpoint. So it's flipping roles of where the harmony is, but then we're hearing the same harmony. Then we might think the next measure is going to be a 3 or 6 or maybe a 1 from what we gotten before, but in fact we get a chord 4, and then in the next measure we go to chord 2 on that high point. So in terms of chords, that's interesting. And then as we probably know from chord 2, it goes to chord 1. And it's actually chord 1 in first inversion being the 6th and then the 3. Chord 2 to 1, not the most interesting thing there. And then in the next measure, we just have chord 1 again in first inversion. So in terms of harmonic rhythm, then we see that there is a little bit of a change because we have now 2 bars taking up 1 chord. But the fact is that it's boring. And this has to do a lot with the fact of where it's occurring, because right after this lengthened chord 1, then we have a chord 7 in first inversion taking us right back to chord 1. So leading us up to that final moment, we've already been hanging around in that area for 2 measures right before that little break in between, taking us right back again to the tonic. So definitely could add some more interest, more of a build-up to the cadence. The high point could be a better choice of a more stable scale degree. And then also, again, there could be some more interest in the register. In the second half, we see we're staying in this upper range of the staff, and throughout the whole beginning, we're doing the same thing, just a little bit higher. We have that leap, but definitely not the most solid example, even with the actual mistakes taken out of it. Next, G minor below, you can see we're in the treble clef again with the soprano to alto range now. In the second measure, we see a perfect fifth, and it is approached in direct motion. Then we see measure 7, there's a fifth again approached in direct motion. So how can we fix those beginning on measure 2? So we could change the fifth just into a third. That also helps with the stepwise motion. And then from the third, it's just leaping down a third to a fifth, where then it's going in stepwise motion up to the third from the fifth, that dissonant fourth passing tone. Okay, we're going to keep going and talk about that in a little bit, but we see the next fifth. Okay, how are we going to fix this fifth? How are we going to approach it in contrary motion? How are we going to change it into something that's not a fifth while maintaining this melodic fluency? Try to think of what we could do to fix this situation. Remember, sometimes we have to fix other things around it because there's nothing really else we can do if we want to check off all the things we've been talking about to create the nice voice leading. Again, try to think of an answer before I tell you. So I ended up having to fix the measure before it. As you can see, we now have a sixth, which goes down to an eighth, then goes to a seventh and a sixth, all using stepwise motion. Then we just have a leap of a third to the next measure, where now we have a sixth, which then leaps up a fourth, and then we have the continuation of the stepwise motion after that. The only problem is that this note creating the sixth is on the very first beat of the measure. It's very emphasized and it's sticking out in the melody, because if you look at the melody, this note is not really functioning anywhere in the melodic fluency, where in other circumstances where you have a leap, sometimes then it'll start going down from there. Maybe it'll start going up from there. But in fact, this leap is just a moment that gets leapt to and then leapt from. It's basically, again, just like a bump in the melody. So there's not much of a purpose for this note other than that it helped us fix the mistake. We can also see that our other option would then result in motivity directly from one measure to the next measure, the same exact notes, and the only difference is the given melody is traveling up a third. So you definitely don't want that. If you think of a better idea, leave it in the comments. Now that we fixed those mistakes, now let's look at the shape of the melody. As we can see, it has a nice shape to it. When there is a slight leap, it is responded to or recovered from. And overall, you can just see a nice shape and a change in the register to where we're starting in the middle of the staff, we're going up a little bit past the top of it, and then we're going back down a little bit past the middle of it again. So nice melodic fluency up to this point, to where we already commented on. We have that little bump in the melody here. Other than that, it goes back to the nice melodic fluency, and we can see mostly steps and some thirds, and everything is interacting with each other in the shape of it. And we have some things going slightly up, and then it'll go slightly down after, and then it'll go a little bit more down and slightly more up or something like that. So we see a nice shape there. And all throughout it, the register is changing a good amount. Okay, then next we see an 8-7-6 pattern with that dissonant passing tone. We see another 8-7-6 pattern, and look at that, they're using the same exact notes against the same note in the given melody. You want to avoid things like that to where you have motivity, especially if there's just a measure in the middle of them, so they're happening in very close proximity. But there's something interesting to comment on here, that you do want to avoid the same patterns, especially close, but if you look at the harmony and the chord that's being applied at the time, two different chords being applied at the same time, while using very similar intervals. Maybe this is something that you'd actually want to leave in there, because it is interesting. But it's just to see these things, the 8-7-6 pattern, and be able to say, okay, maybe I don't want those. Maybe if there was a bunch one after another, it'd be motivic. So look out for things like that. Like here we actually have a 5-4-5, and we have another 5-4-5 pattern, very close to each other again. Here we see a 5-4-3 pattern in the second measure, and we see a 5-4-3 pattern in the second to last measure. These use the same patterns, but they're very far apart from each other, and they're also on completely different chords. One is also the second bar of the entire passage, and the other one is the second to last. Next thing to comment on is that if you pay attention to the chords here, there's quite a lot of different chords in each one of the measures. If you look at each measure, there also is a little bit of some change in the harmonic rhythm. So first, in the third to fourth measure, this can be looked at as like highlighting the same chord, and first we hear an incomplete version of the chord, which then gets completed in the next measure. Other than that, you do have one chord per measure. So after that, it is pretty easy to predict that every single measure is now going to have a change of chord, but it's nice that at least there was a little bit of a slowdown in the harmonic rhythm. But it happening in the very beginning caused it to just be a little moment in there, and then the rest of it was predicted because you could follow, okay, now after that, each measure we're going to have a change in the chord. So that's adding to the fact that if maybe this occurred a little bit later in the melody, then maybe we would have built up that expectation of a change in every chord, and then we would have been thrown off. Something that can be nice for the listener. While in the beginning, since there's the change in the harmonic rhythm, the listener's not really expecting there to be a change of chord every measure yet. There's not really an expectation built up yet. But again, there's a lot of interesting chords. It's not just following a same pattern at all, so you don't expect it to be the same chord, so that's good. Okay, moving on. Next one, we see a perfect fifth here in measure 4. It's being approached in direct motion. What could we do to change this one? So we have a perfect fifth going to an octave, doing contrary motion. So basically I ended up just changing it around, making it different. Here in measure 10, we see a perfect fifth, and it is being approached in direct motion. So what could we do to fix this one? So here's what I came up with. I ended up getting rid of the fifth, which allowed me just to add a dissonant passing tone on the last beat of the measure before it, leading up to a sixth, and then having a third, second, and a third. The only problem with this is that this affects the chord progression that I had going, which was planned out to acquire good voice leading. And now, since the chord is changed, I have to now work with that. Of course, this is why it's good when you're just writing your own music, so you can change things around how you want it. But sometimes you want to work with what you already made. So that's this whole point. We already have something, we're trying to work with it, and this is what we did to work with it. So when you start thinking about chords and all this, you start to get into some more boundaries, and then each of these becomes even more of a challenge, because you're not only thinking, how do I complete this, but how do I complete this using the right chord-to-chord progressions, which not only makes it interesting harmonically, but also allows to have good voice leading when expanding this into more voices when trying to add, let's say, 4 voices, doing 4-part harmony. Of course, we're just doing the 2 voice exercises at this point, but we're about to get into suspensions, the last of the species counterpoint, before we get into florid counterpoint. So we're about to start expanding into more voices. So that's why it's good to start looking a little bit ahead and start planning patterns of doing this, to where we're thinking, if we are going to be expanding to more voices, let's prepare our thought process into how we're going to be doing that, not just leap into all at once. So it might be good to start thinking about chords while you're doing this. It also might be good to not think about chords, so you can just get these done and think about the method of getting these done without thinking about chords in it. But chords aren't going to add anything else but more restrictions and more boundaries when doing this. So it's not like you're going to be breaking any rules, especially when introducing chords. You're just going to be making it a little more of a challenge for yourself. But doing so, you're going to come up with a good pattern of thought of how am I going to integrate chords when trying to do counterpoint, because that in itself can be a challenge. Now actually going back one to the example right before that, there's that one spot where I said I'm going to talk about this later, and in fact I forgot to talk about it. So if there's some things that I don't touch on in these, then it's just the fact that I'm trying to see everything, but I'm trying to focus on certain things at certain points and moving on. I might forget a thing here or there, so just know I'm trying my best to touch on everything, but it's a little bit different when you're sitting here and analyzing all these during a video that you're recording versus just sitting down and trying to analyze it that way. Okay? So I do have notes written down and stuff, but I might forget to read one or two of those notes. What do you think I'm going to say about this, perhaps? It's the fact that we're in minor, and because of that, I'm using my harmonic minor when I'm using some harmony, and when I'm thinking just about the melody, then I'm using the melodic minor. So in fact, you can see most of this is using the melodic minor. The only thing is that here in this measure, we have a melodic minor going down. It's descending. So generally, when you have a descending melodic minor, you're just going to not raise the 6th and 7th degree. So in other words, a descending melodic minor is a natural minor scale. In a lot of cases, that's what a lot of people do. And in fact, when a lot of players are taught the melodic minor scale, that's what they're taught to play. They're taught to play raise sharp at 6th and 7th up and natural minor on the way down. So just something that's existed for a long time. I wouldn't say there's anything taboo about using the melodic minor going down or anything like that, but it's just not customary. It's customary to have that basically natural minor going down, descending. Now when you think of why, this could be the fact that we're using a mode that has a chromatically altered leading tone. The leading tone is a tendency tone that has the tendency to rise up a step to the tonic. But in this case, we're going down to the 6th degree, the raised 6th degree. So to get rid of some of that tension of it wanting to rise up and then going against that, we could just get rid of the raised 6th and 7th degree. Now as it's descending, it descends nicer with less tension and agitation wanting to go the opposite way. And then that brings us down to here to where we have a dissonant passing tone, and it's using the raised 7th degree as the passing tone, and the raised 6th degree are on either side, so it encompasses both in one. It's using the raised 6th and 7th degree on the way up, and it's also using that going down from the 7th degree to the 6th degree. So in this case, it might just be better to get rid of the raised 6th and 7th degree so you don't have that, because the whole thing is that you're going from the 6th degree to the 7th degree, and it's a raised 7th degree, so that might actually want to keep going up, but you're just going back down. So it seems like a perfectly appropriate time to use the natural minor scale, or what some people might call the descending melodic minor scale. So now moving on from there, and since we already finished the one after this, now we're moving on to the second to last one. Next example, we see a perfect fifth on measure 8, and it is approached in direct motion. Now here's the challenge for this one. Keep the perfect fifth and figure out how to approach it in contrary motion. It's not that difficult. Here's what I did. Basically stepwise motion going up to an eighth, and then we just have that third of the 10th. So basically stepwise motion, and then contrary motion to that fifth from the 10th. So here's a choice of a lot better of contrary motion having the imperfect interval going to a perfect interval. So now we fixed that mistake. Now let's look at the melody itself. Let's look at the shape of it, and along the way see if any leaps are out of the bounds or not recovered properly, stuff like that. See the melody swoops down, it goes up with a little bit of a bump, and then we go up here and it's already traveling up, so that doesn't seem like it's random at all. And then we have a leap of a fifth, which is recovered in stepwise motion going up. We then just go a step down, we keep going back up, and then we have a leap of a sixth. That brings us to that compound fifth in contrary motion, and in fact that entire measure to the beginning of the next measure is entirely contrary motion from the counterpoint to the given melody. Then of course we recover that leap of the sixth by going stepwise down, and there's a lot of stepwise motion after this, which again leads us back up to here the C, which then we go to the fifth, which is like a step along the way, going down a third again to here, to where now the melody is going down here, back up, back down. There's nothing really random in the melody that's just sticking out or creating a bump for a random reason. We do see that we're going down and we go up here, but then we just go right back down and we keep continuing. Any moments in the melody that kind of go outside of what's happening are these small things that are then recovered. Like here we actually have a double neighboring tone, used as the cadential formula. Okay, so there's good melodic fluency, the leaps are fine, they're recovered. The thing is, if we look at the leap, the chord that it is highlighting again is chord 2 with the note A, and then again it's creating that fifth, that compound fifth above it, so we have scale degree 6th as the note chosen as our high point. So again, not the best choice for the note or the chord in our high point. The only other thing to comment on would be the use of the melodic minor again. And we can see that we're using it here when we see that we're going up, we're ascending, but we go near the end and we see a case of the same thing. We have a descending melodic minor using the raise 6th and 7th degree. So since this is a melodic instance, and it is highlighting a harmony, but what's going on is melodic, we can get rid of the raise 6th and 7th degree to help a little bit with the voice leading. Other than that, we see the other cases of the raise 6th and 7th degree is ascending. Next example, we can see that on measure 8, we have a perfect fifth, and it is being approached in direct motion. Now, a simple challenge for you for this one, we see that we're implying a first inversion chord here with the intervals of a 6, a third, a 6, and the passing tone of a 7. So what can we do to change this to where we're still approaching the same interval of a fifth, but now we're approaching it in contrary motion while still highlighting the second inversion interval in the measure before? So this is a little bit more of a realistic scenario because you're thinking, okay, I have this chord to the next chord, I want to keep the same chord, what am I going to do? I just want to change something subtle. Here's what I did. I changed it to now where the 6th just leaps up to an octave, so we have it leaping up to the same note as the root note of the implied chord at the time. So it's definitely not changing anything. And then we just have that dissonant neighboring tone, which being a neighboring tone, it's highlighting the fact that it's just embellishing this one note here, the octave. We then see the perfect octave going to the perfect fifth in contrary motion. You're probably thinking, I really like doing octaves to fifths using contrary motion. And I don't remember who said it, but someone said, it feels nice to write adjacent octaves and fifths when you are able to. And although I don't know how much I agree with that because it's not the best voice leading circumstance, it sometimes feels interesting writing an octave to a fifth. Before getting into the shape of the melody like I keep doing, I guess I just want to comment on the use of the harmonic minor here. And that's where here we see that we're using the raised 7th degree, and then the raised 6th degree is occurring where it's occurring as a double neighboring tone. And you do see it's descending from the 7th degree. But in this circumstance, it's acting as a dissonance. So that'll add to the dissonance being that chromatically altered leading tone. But as you can see, it also goes from that raised 6th degree, then in the next measure to the raised 7th degree. So it's basically ending up where it wants to go. I have no idea why I added the key signature in this measure. I'm going to get rid of that. Then we see another case of the descending melodic minor where we're going from D to C here, and in this case we see that it's not a raised 6th and 7th degree. But in the cases where it is ascending, then those are raised. And sometimes just the 7th degree is raised in the measure, which is that harmonic minor. Now to look at the shape of the melody, we can see some interest in the register right from the first to the second measure as it dips down, but it's mostly using stepwise motion. In fact, the first note to the second note is the leap of a fourth, but it's right away recovered down. And in fact, leaps of fourths are not necessary to recover. That doesn't mean it's not good to recover them, it doesn't sound nice and add to the voice leading, but it's not necessary. We see more stepwise motion going into the third measure, and we're going back up into the staff again, so the register is definitely going places. And then we have a leap of an octave from a B to a B, which is then recovered down in stepwise motion. We see the chord chosen for the high point would be G, the third scale degree, and then the note above it forming the 10th, the compound third, would then be the 5th scale degree. So the chosen note for the high point is scale degree 5, so that's good. But the implied chord being chord 3 is not really the best choice for a high point moment, for a point that's going to be sticking out in this melody. This is also chord 3 in minor, which is often going to be a harmonic minor, which would be an augmented third. So a lot of times chord 3 in minor is going to be something you're going to try to avoid in most circumstances. So that's just things to keep in mind here. Let's keep going. You can see the melody then goes where it's going stepwise down. It relocates up a fourth, and then we have more stepwise motion. There isn't really anything random. There's some leaps, and then they're getting responded to. And as we keep going, we see more stepwise motion, and we actually see a lot of interest in the register the entire way. And all the way to the end, we just see a lot of stepwise motion and nothing really random. And not only that, but we see a change in the shape. So in the beginning, we see it's going up and down like a wave, sharp turns, and then we relocate to the top, we go down a bit, then we relocate near the top again, and then we fall towards the middle. From the middle, we stay there for a few measures. We slowly go towards the top, we fall back, stay more in the middle again, and we slowly fall back down, and then we reach our way towards the upper middle again. So it's not just doing the same thing in the shape either. There's a lot of interest in what's going on here. Furthermore, if we look at the intervals chosen, there's a lot of different intervals chosen. Looking at the dissonant note patterns, we don't see a lot of dissonant note patterns that are the same really at all, and especially not right next to each other. Next, if you look at the chords that are chosen, there's a good amount of variety within the chords. There's a slight change of harmonic rhythm in the beginning, but again, for the most part, it's one chord per measure, so that could be spiced up a little bit to add some more interest. But in all, if you actually look at the chords that are chosen, they're pretty good choices from one chord to the next chord, which would allow for good voice leading options, especially when expanding the chords into more voices. And the chord progression itself does not form a predictive pattern. That's it for this video. If you have any questions, feel free to leave it in the comments below. If you like the video, subscribe to see more videos. I'm going to have a lot more coming out. The analysis of the suspension exercises will be up very soon, along with a video about florid counterpoint. If you haven't seen any of the other counterpoint videos, then I'll leave a link in the description of a counterpoint playlist. Until next time, bye bye.